The Mayo Experience.
Mayo Experience. Mayo Experience. Mayo Experience. Experience.
Welcome to the Pat Mayo Experience, the fourth episode of The Grind, a look into people's real lives, not just necessarily in the fantasy sports industry, but the media industry in general. People who I think have pretty cool jobs, explaining how they got there. And if you want to see more of this series, you can just go check out the description of this video or podcast. All the links to the previous shows are in there right now. And if you want to get into a draw for $20 DK, all you need to do is smash the like button for the episode, leave your DraftKings handle in the comment section, and that's it. Boom. You're in the draw for 20 DK bucks. That's all you need to do. Joining me today to talk a little bit about his career, he is the co-host of the Challenge Mania podcast at Shot of Yager on Twitter. It's Scott Yeager. What's going on, my man?
Hey, how are you, Pat?
Listen, man, I'm doing pretty good. I'm so glad you were able to join the show because I find your career super fascinating, delving into just different parts of media, starting up new projects, and really, just based on, you co-host the Challenge Mania podcast, and that's doing great, setting up Patreon, doing live shows. That's a lot of coordination that has to be done, at least from a production standpoint, just learning all that stuff on the fly. Maybe you have a background in that. Let's kind of dig into that a little bit. So your just background in media, where does this all start from?
Yeah, so it's funny. There's an old adage where they say it's like, a 10-year overnight success or something like that. And you mentioned kind of learning on the fly. As far as specifically doing this podcast, specifically doing the live podcast, touring element, running the Patreon, stuff like that, those are, specifically new elements. But just to kind of get to what you had asked about, sort of the start of my career. So I studied film at Syracuse University. I was a film drama major, which means that my core classes, I didn't have to take any science. I didn't have to take any math. So don't ask me to add up the amount of wins divided by the amount of eliminations or something like that. But I had to take acting classes. And so came out of Syracuse Film School. And of course, I think I'm going to be like Steven Spielberg's assistant or, script supervisor on the next Morgan Freeman movie or whatever. And actually, the summer before my senior year, I did a couple days of PA on Indiana Jones, the bad one, the new one. And, got to meet George Lucas and all this stuff. So I graduate. And of course, still living on the East Coast, commuting into New York City from my parents' house in Stamford, Connecticut. And those jobs are a little bit further and far between. And they're also, you kind of have to get in on the ground floor. And, even something like PAing in the film industry is very, kind of incestuous. And you kind of have to get on the list, have people who already kind of are familiar with you and whatnot. So long story short, my first job was as a PA on America's Next Top Model. And I kind of went from that to Project Runway and from that to Amazing Race. And I kind of fell into this career in reality television. And although, I'm a huge movie guy, film, scripted TV buff, and that was always the dream, I fell in love very quickly about the way you can kind of move up the ladder in reality TV a little quicker. And so kind of did that, went from PA to coordinator to production manager to line producer. And for the last 3 years of my career, 3.5, 4 years, I was at one production company where we mainly did travel shows, food shows, sports docs. The guys who started the company were the main editors on the original 24/7 series from HBO. So they kind of brought that look over. We did all the Road to the Winter Classic shows for NHL and the Road to the Quest for the Stanley Cup and whatnot. So that was my, as people like to simplify it, my day job. That's how I earned a living for the, ever since college, in varying degrees of success. Simultaneously, I was also doing a lot of passion stuff on the side that I would never say I was living off of, but it was definitely fulfilling and helping me, be able to go to work and maybe be working on someone else's project while simultaneously kind of doing my own stuff on the side. What I was doing in that regard was and I still kind of am, the managing editor of The Sound magazine, which is a smaller print publication based out of Connecticut, about 50,000 print issues a month. And what I would do was I was doing a lot of the celebrity and artist interviews for that magazine, but I was very early in the podcast wave just by being a fan of podcasts. So I would listen to Bill Simmons and Adam Carolla and Joe Rogan. And so what I would do with these publicists is I would say, hey, instead of just having this live and breathe in one issue of a magazine in Connecticut, in New Jersey, and New York, why don't we do a podcast style? So I was doing my own podcast called A Shot of Yeager. I probably did about 200 episodes. I was interviewing Slash from Guns N' Roses, Bill Maher, UFC fighters, Kevin Bacon, Don Cheadle, all these people that I would interview for whatever projects they're rolling into town for. And in the process back then, and that podcast did not do very well. It was sort of, the guests were so rotating and there wasn't really a niche theme to it that I was never really grabbing an entire audience. Like I might grab a few Bill Maher fans for one episode. I might grab a few Creed fans for one episode. I might grab whoever. They weren't staying throughout. Although I thought I did a good job, it wasn't like maintaining like, a consistent audience ship where I was making money off it. I was enjoying it. I thought it was cool. I would get to go to a lot of stuff for free and whatnot, but it was definitely a passion project. So when the TV stuff started, ramping up again, I kind of had to throw that to the side. I would sneak out of the office into the hallway and like kind of interview Billy Bob Thornton on my phone, but then I would just transcribe it for the magazine. I wouldn't waste people's time putting it up as a podcast, and I wouldn't. I kind of cut that part of my life out a few years ago. Derek Kaczynski comes into play because around the time I was doing my podcast, someone I worked with in reality TV is a mutual friend. They grew up with Derek, and Derek was doing podcasts too at the time. He was sort of doing this thing called Ultimate Challenge Radio that was an absolute disaster, but a lot of people enjoyed it who liked the challenge, and he enjoyed doing that. But he saw what I was doing and thought, wow, this guy's talking to UFC fighters. This guy's talking to actors. He's talking to musicians. That's cool. I want to be doing that. So one day I just get this like unsolicited email. Hello, Scott. This is Derek Kaczynski from Road Rules / The Challenge. I was wondering if you'd ever want to have me on your podcast. So I had him on. We ended up having like a nice rapport. And he said, hey, if you ever need a co-host and whatnot. So we did a couple podcasts together. I think we did one where we interviewed like Mark Long together, Blair Herter. And we did one where we interviewed a UFC fighter who's kind of fallen off the map since, but at the time he had participated in the biggest main event in the history of the UFC, Jake Shields, who headlined a stadium with George St. Pierre around like 2011 or so. So we stayed in contact, but he went and worked in the oil fields, kind of abandoned the challenge as his main career. And I abandoned podcasting as sort of a sub-career because I was my production career was taking off. I was doing a lot more work for these major shows, and I just didn't have the sort of the sweat equity and the mental headspace to be doing this stuff on the side when it wasn't really getting me anywhere. And I, didn't want the people who were signing my paychecks to get rubbed the wrong way and say, because the thing about podcasts, I'm sure there's a lot of promotion involved. So it gets kind of dicey when you're double dipping and you're like, you have someone who's your day job boss who's signing your checks, and they see you online, and online it looks like you didn't even work for them. You have like your own business or your own podcast that you're always plugging. So that's sort of a very, very, very long-winded cliff notes to kind of catch you up why, when Derek, called me a couple years ago and said, hey, I'd love to try this challenge thing again. I had just left my job at the production company I was at, coincidentally. I was taking some few months off to get married anyway. He had just finished Dirty 30. That's why when we started Challenge Mania, although probably 99 out of 100 people had never heard of me, I was very well suited for this particular venture just by my past experience in podcasting, albeit not the most financially viable. My past experience as a production manager, as a line producer, which those skill sets and the stuff that you use in that field are directly exactly what I'm doing today, booking these live shows, putting together these shop sites and whatnot. So, as I said, a 10-year overnight success.
So I kind of want to dig into that a little bit because a lot of people hear a lot of these stuff like when they hear the word gaffer. They know the word gaffer. They don't know what that means. They hear the term.
I look like a gaffer. I'm not a gaffer.
They hear the term like line producer. They don't really know what that means. So can you kind of dig in to tell us a little bit what those tasks actually involve?
Yeah. So basically, it's funny, both in scripted television, film, and also reality television, there's sort of the word producer can mean 1,000 different things. And if you ever watch the credits of a show, especially a movie, you will see executive producer, associate producer. And those titles grow to mean a lot in the industry when you have a resume and other shows are looking for people who have done similar things. But you can have the same title on 10 different shows and have had 10 completely different functions. And so a line producer is the one where it really is the same function on every show. The line producer is in charge of pretty much all the money, all the scheduling, keeping everybody honest, making sure people aren't going into overtime, shoots aren't going into overtime, stuff isn't getting pushed too long, proper money is being spent, everybody's happy. You're sort of, they call it the line producer because you are the top of the above the line, or the bottom of the above the line and the top of the below the line. Below the line, although it sounds like a bad thing, isn't necessarily a bad thing. It just means everyone's sort of tech down. So camera department, anyone like that. So you are sort of the middle person between the creative who are deciding sort of what's happening on screen. Hey, can we do this? Can we not do this? and the people who are going to make it happen. And so that means that if someone's like, oh, it'd be awesome. Can we have Todd ride a camel? And then you have to call the, animal rights people. You have to call the place for filming. Hey, can we bring in a camel? You got to find out how much it is to get a camel, all this stuff. And then you got to either tell them no, or you got to tell them yes, and how much it's going to be. Hey, Todd, we can get the camel, but we're going to have to insure Todd. That's going to cost this much. Then we can't do the waterfall thing, stuff like that. So on set, it becomes, especially when you're a production manager, which is kind of a notch below line producing, it's more in the field. A line producer will often stay in the office. That way they're kind of onto the next thing. A production manager more often will travel or be on set and kind of making sure stuff is happening on time. So it's a lot of logistics. It's very, the non-cushy elements of a TV show. It's a very thankless job. It's one of those things I always used to say that if something goes wrong, you hear about it immediately. If nothing's gone wrong, you don't get a call to say that stuff went well. You just don't get a call. So it's like your phone isn't ringing, great. You don't get you might at the end of a season get like a thank you email or a text, whatever. But it's not the same thing. It's like you're getting a different amount, a large output of negative, complaints or oh my God, why wasn't my room ready? Or why is so and so late? How come there's not enough food? You get all that stuff. But you never get the just calling to let you know there was just a perfect amount of food. Hey, just calling to let you know the actor was in such a good mood today. It's almost as if he's being paid properly. So it sounds like he is. Thank you. So all that stuff is sort of, you go to bed every night without having gotten yelled at about something, and that's a win. So it was one of those things where it's not necessarily so I'm a creative minded person. I love when I do interviews with people, I'm constantly trying to come up with the fun questions. I'm constantly trying to come up with when I was doing articles, fun headlines. I'm really into branding, stuff like that. Whenever I was on set, I was always kind of chiming in with ideas. So it's sort of the antithesis of what if you asked me 10 years ago, what sort of role would you want in a television career? So what ended up happening was I kind of would put it out there every so often. Hey, I'd love to be a segment producer. Hey, I love it. And it just never took, it was never the right chance to just kind of give someone their first segment producer job. So I just kind of took it in stride. I was like, you know what, I'm gonna stop asking, stop putting it out there. A couple times I did, they kind of just, oh, you know what? It sounds like he doesn't even really want to be a PM. Maybe we get someone who actually wants to be a PM. So what I did was I kind of just took it in stride. And in the process, developed all these skills that I'm now able to repurpose for this venture, which is very fulfilling. Challenge Mania, as you know, Derek as well, but myself, I'm at the forefront of it. There's a lot of creativity involved. I'm the host of the show. I mean, I sat there for years booking flights and catering and this and that and managing budgets so other people could host other shows, albeit this is a podcast, it's not on television, but now it's my show. So the fact that I got those 10 years of experience doing all that stuff, it wasn't wasted because now I can do the job of 5 people for our business that we just started. And we're at a couple notches above where we would be because I didn't have to bring in somebody who could do all those things properly.
Yeah, I think that's a thing that people overlook even when it comes to something as just audio podcasting, like sound engineering, knowing the tech and making it sound good from day one. I mean, a lot of people, if they're just starting up a podcast, they can't afford to hire a sound engineer or don't even think about hiring a sound engineer or buying the right microphones, knowing what microphones to buy. Like even when I moved studios to the one I'm in right now, we had lavalier mics and just the studio wasn't equipped to handle the sound. So we had to switch to, the better microphones, and all of a sudden we're sounding a whole lot better. But I like the way that you kind of put that, just you grinded the 10 years in the business, you worked your way up and you learned all these different facets. I'm very much the same way. When I first started out, I was shooting videos on a green screen out of my dingy apartment. I was sound mixing everything. I was building graphics for everything. Then I go to a TV network and all of a sudden, I'm doing all aspects of a video show and an audio show, but I also have to cut in breaks and send that to master control so they can properly put in the right amount of advertising so it can air on TV. And just knowing each of the different steps has really helped me be able to make this as small of a production as possible, yet still retain the same amount of quality. I do want to kind of circle back, though. You leave Syracuse, you say you're living in Connecticut and commuting into the city. Do you find that is, because I find that I'm in downtown Toronto, and this is something that people really struggle with, that a lot of these first media jobs that people get are either volunteer work for absolute minimum wage, below minimum wage, you work ridiculous hours, and you really can't afford to live in one of these major metropolitan hubs. Like commuting every day, that's something that you had to put in, and you had the ability to do that. Do you find that people get boxed out of the industry a lot just because they simply can't afford to live where the work is?
Yeah, totally. And I was someone who both in college, I had the luxury of over the summer, my mother or through some contact, I, had a couple internships where they didn't pay me. In fact, I got college credit because and the other thing is then later on in my career, I was the one who was responsible for our internship program at my production company. And the rule is that you have to be hiring people who can get college credit because in essence, and a lot of companies do pay interns, that's fine, but most internship programs are unpaid. And to do that legally, at least in the state of New York or New York City, they have to be getting college credit. The flip side of that is colleges charge people for credits because it means it's a class you're not taking. So in essence, my parents were paying like $1,500, $2,000 a summer for me to work at like Sony's Pictures Television or for Bob Balaban's Chicago Films, I think it was called. And that's a luxury that a lot of kids don't have, a lot of families don't have. It would break my heart when people would, because I would often put up, because my production company, we were often looking for maybe 1-2 interns each semester or each, especially if we had a big project going on, it's extra hands and stuff. And I will say that, the internships I had were a little bit bogus in the sense that I could tell I was doing work that really didn't need to be done. And since I was there, they're having me read like scripts and writing coverage, which is basically like a summary. It's like a book report. It's like the only time in my life I actually read something and wrote a book report for things that like obviously are never going to get made because like you would have read this already if this was something you were actually going to make. Whereas at my production company, people were getting valuable on-set experience, which is something as a film major in college, I can say a lot of our education I found to be pretty bogus because you get these kids who would apply for internships and their resume says like, I was the executive producer and director of this. And it's like, it was their student film. And like, in film school too, like you have to make your own movies and that's all great and stuff like that. But you get more experience being like a production assistant on an actual set than you do making your own film. Your creative juices get flowing and you kind of get inspired making your own film. But as far as becoming a cog in the overall wheel of the industry, I highly recommend getting out there and doing it. The problem then is that, if you're not getting paid for it or you're only getting college credit, that really does cut out a lot of people. There's a lot of kids. My wife, who does a lot of teaching with the Police Athletic League, teaches, urban youth and underprivileged kids acting and stuff like that. And every so often, one of them would inquire about our internship program because a lot of them were in high school or college at the time. And when I got to the point where I told them that we could not pay them, they couldn't do it. And it's one of those things where they would love to have done it. And I would have loved to have hired them, but I legally can't hire them because I have to hire somebody who can get college credit. And they also internally just can't waste that amount of time on something that isn't getting them, say, $100 a day that they can take home to mom and dad or that they can put towards their student loans or whatever. So it totally does that. It really is, it stinks. It really does, and what stinks also, I will say, is that it kind of probably discourages people from getting out there and doing it because you see the same type of people who come in, and a lot of them, they kind of almost have a little bit of I don't want to say this condescendingly, but a lot of interns who walked into me, like were very quick to tell me day one, just to let you know, like I'm a great editor in case you guys need an editor. And look, I get that because like I might have had that mentality when I was 20 or whatever, but I get the feeling that someone who doesn't have the position in life where their parents can let them just, they don't have to work for the summer and they can take an unpaid internship and stuff like that. They're probably a little, more likely to come in and kind of do what they need to do and they want to learn and this and that. Whereas a lot of the people that came in, and because that's kind of the crowd you're dealing with when you're dealing with people who can work for free, they're coming in and they're just like, oh, I'd love to show you the film I made and I'm a great director if you guys ever need a director. And so there's a thing where the people who are really hard workers and the people that you actually need, unfortunately, you're pricing them out and they probably end up losing interest in the business, losing interest in television, getting involved in sort of a trade that's more practical. And then by the time they're 24, 25, they're making serious money in that trade. And why would you start over and become a PA at that point? So yeah, I totally agree with you. The commute aspect of it is terrible, especially in Manhattan, where it is impossible to live here unless you have like a really booming career or you're sharing a room with 4 other people. And a lot of these jobs start early in New York too, where there would be kids who'd be like, hey man, I know the shoot's at 6 a.m. The train won't even get me there by then. And that's the only way I can get in. So that happened to me a lot. I was lucky. I lived in Connecticut. I had parents who would let me live there for free. I would drive in or I would take the train in. And Lord knows, like at the time I was only making $120 a day. I'm sure my parents were helping me out. So without all that stuff, who knows? Who knows where I would have been? Who knows if I would have been able to lay the groundwork to get me to where I was in that industry or where I was today. Yeah, it's a big problem. I wish that there was a better way around it. But having been that person, the line producer who's responsible for the budgets of these projects and the budgets of these companies and whatnot, it isn't possible. It's not possible to necessarily bring in 5 people for, a certain wage every day for this amount of time. It's not. And I wish there was some sort of a way where both companies, both parties, the company and the person working, could be properly served in that regard. It would influence people to hire from a different base, and it would influence those people to stick with it for longer if they were actually being compensated for their time.
Well, the big thing that you hit on there was, when interns show up and someone's paying for what they do, they don't really put in the same sort of required effort to learn what they need to learn. But it feels like it goes 50-50. Like, I just look at a lot of the people that I graduated broadcasting school with, like 50% stuck. The other 50 got boxed out after a year and a half because they weren't hosting something they wanted to do. They weren't directing something they wanted to do. It didn't seem like they were really apt to take one of these, like a line producer job or a PA job. They kind of wanted to be the person right away. And if that didn't happen, they were done.
Yeah, and it was also, I will say, and it's interesting, not all PA jobs are the same. So you'll see, and this is just luck of the draw. Some people came and worked for us, and they had a semester where, we shot a lot, but it wasn't in New York, and we're not going to travel an intern. So they did a lot of gear pickups, they did a lot of copying, and they were probably discouraged or thought PAing sucks. But then there are some people who they essentially got to be like an extra PA on set. They're around celebrities all the time. They're around athletes. One of the projects that I did towards the end of my career over there, we can get into the voiceover thing, but we did this show called Give, where I was also the narrator, but I was the production manager as well. And that show, every episode had a different celebrity host that came into. We went to a charity, and they pretended they were there to kind of just do like a news piece or something. And then at the end, you got to reward this charity with a nice donation from a rotating foundation that would change every episode. So it's cool because if you're a PA on that show, you get to be around a celebrity. You're meeting Mark Teixeira or Blair Underwood or someone like that. And also you're getting to see this great stuff. You're around all these kids. You see these people genuinely getting money that they're using. So that's you work on that and that's your first thing. That probably buys you a little bit of patience if your next 3 jobs suck, but the guy who came and worked for us and had to make copies and get coffee for 3 months, he's probably like, you know what, maybe I should just work for Uncle Mark and at his hedge fund or whatever. This is kind of boring. So it's crazy, the luck of the draw. I mean, I've worked on so many different projects where I've had so many different levels of sort of necessity, so many different levels of excitement on a day-to-day basis. Some of the most exciting jobs I ever had were PA jobs, because often a PA will be in the thick of it. They'll be close because here, we don't want a lot of people around right now because we're shooting an intimate scene, or we don't want a lot of people around right now because Heidi Klum doesn't like to be bothered, or whatever it is. But guess who we do need? We do need somebody watching the door. We do need somebody handing her this. We do need somebody telling George Lucas this. So there are more opportunities sometimes for the person lowest on the totem pole to really be in the thick of things than, say, the person 13th on the totem pole. Because then if you have the 13th person, you got to have the 14th and the 15th or the 12th. So let's just not have any of those people, but you do need Steve to watch the door. So, I mean, it's funny. In my career, it's like the title does not necessarily always correlate with how redeeming the job was. Sometimes it's about the people you're working with. Sometimes it's about the proximity to the action. So the more you get out there and do it, the more that stuff will you'll get bit by the bug and you want to stick with it. I see a lot of people, I can tell, I can just read the energy within a few minutes. I'm just like, this person they do not want to be doing this. They do not want to be putting in the legwork. And that's why I do recommend people start out as PAs. Granted, not every PA job is the same, as I said, but it really can give you those moments that kind of keep you going. Obviously, there's a lot of grunt work. There's a lot of carrying stuff. There's a lot of waking up early. There's a lot of being the last man out. There's a lot of cleaning garbage. But those are the times where at your point in your career, it's probably the coolest that you're checking in Jessica Alba to be a guest judge on Project Runway. It's probably the coolest that you're one of 3 people in this top model house at 2 a.m. while they're having this conversation, but everybody else is home and you're sitting here watching a control room. So those moments are probably going to present themselves more the more you work, the more you put yourself out there. And the pay is not going to be great, but you got to find other ways to, feel good about it. It's not just going to be the pay. And someone like me, I had that luxury to be able to not care only about the pay. There's thousands and thousands of kids out there that they have to check that box first, or they can't even do it. Literally, physically cannot do it. I need to be bringing home 120, 150 bucks a day, or I can't be giving you half of my day. I just can't do it. And that's sad. It sucks.
Well, the other thing that goes hand in hand with that too, that I found that people who have stuck it out in media and have actually established a career and been somewhat successful, is the grinding part of it. Like at one point you're working as a part of a production company, working all these jobs, you're working in print media, you're doing a podcast. It seems to me that, continue, like, how many hours a week are you putting in? That sounds like, 70, 80, 90 hours between commuting, doing 3 jobs. Like, the people who don't stick to the grind and actually put forth that full effort to try to explore as many avenues as possible seems to be the ones that end up out of the business.
Well, the production industry literally does not abide by the rules of every other industry. The term 9 to 5 always used to kill me because, like, that's the term, like in songs when they're talking about a day job, a hard-working day job. It was working 9 to 5. Guess what? If you work in production, it's 9 to 9:30. It's 12 hours and you don't get paid for your lunch. So it's 12 and a half hours. And so when, it's one of those things where then that's just how it is. And the other thing is you get paid by the day. You get sort of a flat rate that, yes, does break out to hours on a time card. But when you really start to look at it, it's like, okay, if I'm working 6 days a week for 12 and a half hours a day, yes, my paycheck looks pretty damn good. But if I'm comparing it to what my friend does who like manages a Foot Locker, like he's got it easy. You know what I mean? So it's one of those things, holidays, people be like, so what are you doing for Memorial Day? And it's like, that doesn't matter. Like if you're on a show that's shooting, you're shooting through Christmas sometimes Thanksgiving. What if you're on a show that's shooting and the subject matter is like a family and you're shooting their Thanksgiving dinner? Guess where you are on Thanksgiving? Not with your family or with the Kardashians. And like, some people might think that's cool, but a lot of people, every year, the big one was Halloween. Because Halloween doesn't register as a real holiday in mostly any industry. It's not like if you work on the stock exchange, you're getting off for Halloween and whatnot. But regardless, you work with a lot of camera guys, audio guys, where Halloween becomes the most important holiday once you have a kid. Like I just have I have a 2.5-month-old son at home, and I can't wait for his first Halloween, his second Halloween and whatnot. But it's like, you're a line producer, you're a production manager, and it's like, no, we're shooting on Halloween. And that's the one you get the most requests by these guys. And sometimes it's the DP who like, you need him. And he's like, dude, cannot work Halloween. And like, but that's the thing. It's like, there are so many moving parts and you have locations, you have weather, you have all this stuff that when you have to factor in like everybody's, I don't want to work on Halloween, it's impossible. So, you just, certain things and certain common courtesies that happen in other industries are just like not a thing in production. Like the scheduling, the hours. I mean, the time that you might have to wake up to go and start a day of shooting is not a time you would have to wake up at doing any other job other than if you were like a doctor and you were getting a house call for an emergency. No other industry are you waking up sometimes at 3:30 in the morning. And do you have to just like walk in looking chipper, holding a coffee, ready to go at 5? Like that just doesn't happen in any other industry. But the thing is that we as people love television, we love celebrities, we love sports. So a lot of people want these jobs. It's like ESPN, is a thing where it's like they can treat people however they want because so many people, it's a dream to work for ESPN. I mean, like for me, it's funny. This didn't end up going anywhere, but quick fantasy tie-in. After I had worked a couple PA jobs, I was a diehard listener at the time of Matthew Berry's Fantasy Focus podcast. And one day they were like, hey, we're looking for an assistant. And so I submitted my resume. It only had like 2 credits on it, but at Syracuse. And I get this email from them. Hey, it's so-and-so for ESPN. I want to set up a phone interview with you and Matthew Berry. And I did the interview. Finally, they like kind of like dodged me like 3 times. I had to reschedule. They finally got me on the horn. I did like a 30-minute phoner with Matthew Berry where he interviewed me for this position. And during the interview, I was just basically trying to like oversell myself. Like, hey, I know you have this previous career as a screenwriter. I really would love to have you as a mentor and blah, blah, blah. And like, I'm a big fantasy guy and a big podcast guy, but I have so many other interests and kind of oversold myself. Ended up not getting the job. It was a great conversation, but and ended up following up with him, say, 8 months later and, sending him another email. Hey, 10 other production gigs down the drain, or for lack of a better term. I was wondering if you guys still need any help. And he was like, hey, if it makes you feel any better, we ended up not going with anybody. They just like cut the funding for the position in general. So it's like they probably ended up hiring an intern to do this like, thankless job. And they're not paying him anything because they get a billion resumes because it's ESPN. So it's like, it's one of those things where in production and doing the hiring too, it's sad to say, but I have this mentality too. There's someone else who wants the job. There's somebody else who will do it for less. And that sucks too. Production also has this thing where you ask someone what their rate is. That's not a thing in the real world. In production, you might say to somebody, Pat, what's your rate? And then you have to think, oh man, well, I feel like I should get $400 a day. But if I say 400, are they not going to hire me? Maybe I say 350. Do I say 5 and hope that they say yes to 5? 400. And then when you say 400, if my budget really had 600 for it, I go, done. And then when I answer so quickly, you're like, damn it, I should have said 500. But you can't go back and say, can I have 500? No other, the other thing is when someone asks you your rate, they might even say, oh, that's your rate. Can you just list a reference? I just want to make sure that is what you got paid on your last job. That's not legal, but these are things that happen in production. It's like the wild, wild west because people want to work on the movie Wild, Wild West so bad that they're willing to lower their standards for all these things that in the real world, there's like, I mean, and there are big conglomerates that trust me. If you're working for NBC Universal and Bunim even, and like there is HR and there is, process with a lot of these things, but for a lot of these production companies and a lot of the like on-set kind of politics, I mean, you're completely rewriting everything you've learned in business school or in, if you just studied law or something like that. It's just completely different. It's a different world. So it's not for the faint at heart, for good reason. But
do you have any advice for that? If someone asks you just like, hey, how much is like, because it happened to me very early in my career. People would ask me to write something, be like, hey, how much do you want for this? And I actually learned, not quickly, but at some point, like I started getting asked by people to write stuff for places I just had no interest in doing. But I was like, hey, I could use the extra money. So in order to kind of box myself out of it, I would rate myself like 4 or 5 times higher than I ever thought anyone would ever pay me and just demanded that, assuming they would say no. And then all of a sudden people are saying yes. I feel like people undervalue what their services are in general because they either want a job, but it's not until you don't want a job, but will do it for a certain price that's exorbitant that you find out, hey, maybe people will actually pay for this.
Yeah, it's on a case-by-case basis because, I've been the person who I'm trying to figure out how much I should charge this person for. And I've also been the person asking someone how much they will do something for. So I've had both psychologies played out to me, and I've had to deliver the same psychology back at people. To me, when I'm the person who's setting the rate, who I want to get paid X amount of money, you're totally right. If it's something I don't want to do, I'm hitting them with a figure that it's a Godfather offer. It's an offer you can't refuse. To use a kind of a weird analogy here, the place I live had this flea market recently, and I'm a collector of memorabilia and autographs and stuff like that. And I decided to get a free table at this flea market, and I spent a couple weeks putting price tags on all my stuff. And I sat out there, and my wife and even my mom and a couple people who had come to the table were kind of like, are you expecting to sell any of this stuff? I'll give you an example. Like I had a Jimmy Carter signed book, and I priced it for a couple $100. And if you do your due diligence online, you can find one for way cheaper. But my thing was like, to me, it's like, this is my collection. I'm not in dire straits right now. I don't need to sell any of it. If the Titanic was sinking and I needed to sell all this stuff, sure, I would price it like must sell. But to me, it's like, I'm going to price it as something where if somebody comes and takes it off my hands for that, great. I also am going to price it at something where the last thing I want is for somebody to come pick up, look at a price and say, steal, awesome, I'm going. I want them to say, would you do it for this? And then at that point, the number that they're buying it for might even be more than I would go to. But, I've made them feel like they got a deal. And it's the same thing with, pricing yourself to work. For me, the last thing I ever want when I'm hiring somebody is for me to offer them an amount of money and they say done, because that tells me as a line producer, crap, there was probably $50 there I could have saved and put on someone else who won't do it for less than that. The longer people work in the industry, the more of a hot commodity they are, the more they can say no to stuff. I'll give you an example. Like, so that Project Give, on all accounts, the celebrities that were involved, the people who worked on the show, myself as a voiceover actor, so many people made concessions to work on that show because you look at it and you're like, okay, somebody sure is making money on this. The network is making money on advertising. I'm sure the guy who owns the company made a sweet deal when he sold the show. But for the most part, we're all taking a bath on this. Blair Underwood's taking a bath on this. Jenna Bush Hager is not getting paid what she should be, who's now the host of the Today Show, is not getting paid what she should get paid because everyone knows that we're making a show about giving money to charity. So people are more likely to make concessions there than they are when you're kind of like, come and work on this thing where everybody's making a lot of money and you're not. I'll tell you the one segment of people who never take a break, is cut you a break, and are often the highest paid people on set, and it makes me sick. Although I understand they are artists in their own right and they do great work, the hair and makeup people. I've worked on sets where the hair and makeup person, because they're the person that the celebrity requires, and they refuse to say, like, because I can find somebody for $500 a day. But it's, Tanya has been working with Chrissy Teigen her whole life. It's got to be Tanya, whatever it is. I'm not saying this happened with Chrissy Teigen, who's lovely, by the way. But regardless, Tanya's rate might be $2,000 a day. And you're explaining, you're like, That's more than every person, the person who's directing this show, the person who's producing this show, the person who's she's making more than the person whose hair she's doing on the show. Doesn't matter, we need Tanya. And then Tanya, the hair and makeup person, is the highest paid person on a set because they will never, ever, ever cut you a break. I don't know what, maybe it's because they have another celebrity client here. They have another thing there. Their time is so, and I'm talking for an hour of work. I'm talking not even to come to set, to do them before they go. Sometimes $2,000, $4,000 a day, those hair and makeup people.
That's amazing. I would have not guessed that would have been the case for as someone who does their own hair and makeup, as people can see, not well. It's a great cost savings to do it that way. You go to Mac, you buy your $40 makeup, go on your way. But that's outrageous. But I think it makes a lot of sense, though. It's almost like if you carry a big brand with you and then you can sell off that brand. The hair and makeup person's brand is the celebrity they are attached to. So that is their cachet. And if that actor or actress doesn't want to work, then that person might not work either. So you really have to strike while the iron's hot.
Yeah, two things I'll say is that when people ask like tips and stuff like that or advice, I would say that if you genuinely are interested in it, I'm not saying go and fake your entire life, but if you're someone who's interested in like hair and makeup or maybe wardrobe or something like that, and you do want to work in the industry, go that route. Even if you one day want to be a producer or something like that, those people make bank. And the other side of that is that, for me, I was never really a great technical person. It was never my strong suit. But, working on all these sets and seeing what a lot of these cinematographers, directors of photography, even, camera operators make, those guys make a lot of money too. So if that's something that you're interested in, I know like the school of thought is, I'd rather be the director than the DP, or I'd rather be the producer than the camera operator. A lot of these shows don't even have those positions sometimes. Director sometimes doesn't even exist on most of these reality shows. They don't even have that position. It's, you have a showrunner, and then you have like a DP who's essentially directing in camera. So those guys make a lot of money. I'm talking $2,000 a day. All these guys own their own gear, and they come as package deals with their gear. That's another thing. So you end up in 10 gigs, you've paid the whole thing off. And then from then, you're essentially making double your rate, because even if, there comes a simplicity to, first of all, some of them require it. They're like, you're only getting me if you get me and you pay for my C300 for $500 a day, whatever. So there's that. They hold you ransom. But the other thing is, it does help a little bit to not have to send a PA to go pick up a camera kit, or, the guy's familiar with it, or if something's wrong with it, it's on him. So it is a nice give and take there, but that's also more money these guys are banking. So, or these guys and gals are banking. So if you're a man or a woman out there who'd like to work in the TV industry and are sort of, interested in the technical elements of it, go with that. You can always, there's a lot of people, these camera guys who build up years and years of clout, who now they can sell a show just because they're attached to it. There's some of these guys who become really famous, in particularly like the sports doc world, because they are the ones who created that iconic look. If you've ever watched like a 24/7 of the boxing series on HBO or a Hard Knocks, you know what I'm talking about. It's that super slow-mo. It's that really cool look that kind of reinvented the sports doc. It used to be that old film look that they did with NFL films. And now it's this new look that when you see a sports doc, like a UFC Unleashed, there's people who essentially created that. And when you hire them, you know that they're giving you that. And those guys make a ton of money. Those guys and gals, I should say, make a ton of money. And those guys and gals can go into a production company and say, hey, I will make your show look like this. I want this credit, whatever, this and that. So don't think that you only have to go the one route to get there, especially if money's important to you. Those fields, the technical fields, are loaded with it.
So I guess the one other thing too, I want to talk about this voice acting work. So when you first started doing this, you put yourself in position to be a narrator by working on this. But since then, have you done other voice acting work? Do you
I love this story because this story doesn't even start with Give. So I had always, having done the podcast, I was a singer in a band. Like I've always always done impressions. I've always been the funny guy at parties. I've done stand-up and stuff like that. So to me, voice acting was always something that appealed to me. And right before I started dating my now wife, this movie came out, awesome movie called In a World. I think it just hit Amazon Prime, directed and written by Lake Bell, beautiful actress, amazing writer, director as well. And it's about this woman's voiceover career, but it's also about the voiceover industry as a whole. It's hilarious. It's adorable. Watch In a World. So I had just seen that movie. I start dating my now wife, Lindsay, who also has a booming voiceover career. And one of the first 5 or 6 times I'm over at her apartment at the time, she's doing an audition. And I'm like, I've always wanted to do voiceover. I always thought I'd be good at it. Of course, she's like calling my bluff. A few months later for my birthday, she ends up taking me to this nondescript building in Hell's Kitchen here in New York. And she's like, oh, this is your present. And I'm like, what is it? She's like, I got you a consultation with my old voiceover coach, Bruce, over at Abacus, by the way. So everything I'm saying, if you do want to start a voiceover career or do any of the things I'm about to talk about, look up Abacus Entertainment. Bruce can help you out. And they did my demo and all this stuff. So anyway, I go in, I do like an hour thing where he just has me reading copies, giving me notes, whatever. And I loved it. So I ended up buying like a 5-course package where I go and just have one-on-one lessons. Then at the end of it, I paid at the time, I think the rate has gone up, but at the time I paid about $1,500 kind of investing in myself to make a demo. Now, what this demo was is I go in there and these guys, that Bryant is the other wizard over there, Brian and Bruce, and they go and they listen to your voice and then they're like, okay, these are the things you're going to be good at reading. So he essentially writes copy for me. He's like, oh, you know what? He's like, this will be good. He's like, I'm in the booth. He's like, can you say this? I have a beard, but I'm not a hipster. And we write this fake ad for Joe's Organic Coffee. And so we cut together this thing that makes it seem like I've already booked 15 spots. I've been on the air for 10 years, but they were all fake. We all did them in the booth. They put the sound effects in. It's great. I then take this demo and I email, 10 of the biggest agencies in New York. I don't hear back from any of them. My problem was my subject line was Scott Yeager's voiceover demo or new voiceover talent or something like that. And being on the other side of this, I realized like sometimes like you're not ready for unsolicited pitches. You're just not, okay, I'm delete, whatever. So then I tried to trick these people into opening it. So I sent the same email, same pitch, same demo, but the subject line was so RE : voiceover. Not my name, not what it is, not a voiceover for what. Tricked them into thinking, oh, is this something I'm expecting? Then they've opened it. This time around, I got 4 or 5 responses. I ended up meeting with a couple of them. I freelanced with 1 or 2 of them for a little bit. And within about 4 or 5 months, I signed with my current agent, CESD, otherwise known as Cunningham. And I've been with them for 4 years now. I signed with them. First thing off the bat that I did that got me into the Screen Actors Guild was a New York Lotto commercial. Play the I Love New York scratch off and you can win blah, 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 blah. I entered the Screen Actors Guild, which at the time the dues were to join were about $3,000. Again, betting on yourself. But since then I've been in the Screen Actors Guild and, get auditions through my agent and have been in my voice has been in probably about, a dozen, 15 commercials that you probably, I don't know about in Canada, but here in the US, you've probably seen or heard during Monday Night Football, Survivor, Big Brother, The Challenge, whatever you watch, you probably heard my voice. Then simultaneously, while I was doing this, and the cool thing of doing voiceover, you do a lot of auditioning for stuff you don't get. I mean, I was, at the time I was working in production, I was still going out. And luckily, I worked in a pretty cushy situation where I could leave a few times a day and it not be the end of the world. I didn't have a boss that's looking over my shoulder all the time because I was often working late at night, working on weekends. She didn't care that I would, disappear for an hour here or there. And that was great because I could go and audition for stuff and I could do kind of both things at once. And it actually helped because then when I would do sizzles for them where if they're trying to sell a show, instead of having to pay for a voiceover guy, I would just do it for them for free. Like, we did the show Carpool Karaoke where they wanted kind of a sleazy kind of TMZ kind of thing. Like today on Carpool Karaoke, we're going to see if Taylor Swift knows what she's doing, whatever. And I would do stuff like that. And then when Give came around, the EP who knew I did voiceover was like, I'd love to have you read for this. And I had to audition for it. It's not like it's not like they paid me less than they would pay someone else. It's not like if I sucked or I wasn't right for it, they wouldn't have given it to me. But I ended up, they ran it up the chain. The network liked it. Everybody liked me. And then it became dually beneficial because now their voiceover actor is working in the production office where they record the voiceovers, where they edit the show. If they need to get a pickup on there and stuff like that. So the Give thing, many people might think that my career started that way. It actually didn't. And that's something I kind of did, just because I haven't really, that's the only show I've ever narrated. I predominantly do commercial work. And, I would love to do more narrating. I would love to do more animation stuff. But for the most part here in New York, the bigger market for voiceover acting is commercials. That's the one show I've ever narrated. So it's not like I kind of backtracked and started doing voiceover from there. I had this like 2-3 year voiceover career. And then that was just kind of a natural fit. So that's the voiceover stuff. Now it's funny doing the podcast, like, I do all our live reads. I do all our plugs and stuff like that. So it kind of helps maybe having a voiceover actor involved in this venture as well, because I can kind of do my, podcast interview voice. And then I can do we're coming to Los Angeles for Challenge Mania Live on June 22nd. I can do that too. So that's the voiceover thing in a massive nutshell.
Okay, so just to tie this into the challenge a little bit, my producer Paul and I, we do the challenge show together and we do the recaps. And for years we've been talking about that At some point, it seems like TJ doesn't necessarily know all the rules of what he's explaining, or maybe it takes a long time for him to explain a lot of things, and you just see like a lot of wide shots. Or for a while, I was convinced they were shooting him on a green screen after the fact, describing this. But how much of this stuff on the challenge, just for expediency's sake, to make it efficient, to make it so the explanation isn't 8 minutes, it's 30 seconds, and it's very concise to the audience? How much of that do you actually think is like pickups after the fact in post-production?
So what I love about our podcast and the dynamic of it, and it's not something we kind of sell as the point of it or anything like that, is that you have Derek, who's, one of the, most respected cast members ever on the show, 3-time champion. He's been on that side of the camera of the show for years. He's had the reality star experience, one that I will never have or could never have, and still to this day has it. And myself, having worked behind the scenes in a dozen different capacities in the television industry, specifically in the reality television competition industry, I can kind of fill in a lot of the gaps with questions like you just asked. And sometimes it's one of those things where we don't even need a guest to overstep, or we don't even need someone because sometimes the cast members that we have on don't even know the answers to this. We don't even have to have a producer of the challenge on to answer these questions. I'm happy to do so for you. With TJ within the last few years has really, I think, kicked it up a notch as far as how much he cares, how much like added research he's doing, making sure he knows his stuff. I'd imagine early on he might have somebody feeding him the lines in earwig, which is kind of like a security thing that you might see Secret Service have, or he might have someone there kind of reminding him. I will say this: I've worked on a dozen reality competition shows where you read the rules out like that. They have to be read out in a way that makes sense to the viewer and makes sense to the cast members involved. People will ask follow-up questions. Sometimes things don't come out clearly. And the other thing is the angles. So you're shooting this stuff multi-camera, but you're also going to do it a few different times. So you then are cutting it together into one succinct thing. But for the most part, you got to get the clean of TJ, and maybe he messes that up a little bit and you do it again. You got to get the wide of the cast members. You got to get some reaction shots of the cast members. I don't know that they actually do this. You might cheat some reaction shots, like, okay, everybody act surprised, everybody act pissed, whatever. Sometimes maybe you're not on the right person and they give you the perfect reaction, but you really want to get it. That's when people ask me, is reality TV fake? I honestly say it's 90% real, but you will have someone walk into a store 3 times to make sure that you have the proper angle or the proper shot or the proper reaction. We have done even on that show Give, where they come and surprise them with the check. We would do that organically, and we had that. And they really were surprised, but then we might get it again. You know what I mean? And so with TJ, I'd imagine it's one of those things where he explains the rules, and then they get home and they're in the edit bay and they realize, okay, that's a little redundant. That wasn't that clear. Can you bring in TJ? TJ, can you add in this little, they call it ADR, which is, additional digital recording, where it's basically maybe add the fact that it's like, you'll be going home today, or pick your partner. Little things that were left out that might have been clarified but by an off-camera producer or something like that, to where when you're watching it, when producers are sitting there doing the screening, they're like, if I'm a viewer at home, that makes no sense to me. And that's why sometimes you'll hear like a Frankenbite, which is where you can really tell because some of the audio goes up or it doesn't sound as clean, where it's like, welcome here to Namibia, where you're going to be competing for $5,000. And you're like, oh, that sounded like it was edited together. It's probably because in the moment, maybe he said 5 Gs and it wasn't clear, or, someone interrupted or whatever, or they didn't love the shot. Whatever the reason is, yes, they do cut in a lot of that stuff, but it's on a case-by-case basis. I'm sure they'd love to all go home and have everything in the can and not have to bring in anybody for added recordings, but it just happens. It happens on every show. I mean, it could happen on a cooking show where it's like you forgot to say nutmeg. Can we have someone say nutmeg? Can I say nutmeg? I've had it where people bring me in and say, hey, we really don't want to have to bring in, fill in Chef A again. Can you try to sound like her and say nutmeg? And you've probably heard my voice disguised as like a Southern woman's voice saying nutmeg, because they didn't want to fly her back in to say nutmeg or have her do it on her phone. So, I mean, it's like stuff like that happens all the time across the industry. It's not limited to the challenge.
All right, well, let's dig into the challenge, though, because Challenge Mania has become a sensation in terms of the challenge world, because it kind of works on 2 things. And I kind of figured this out. Like, I got into sports, I started doing pop culture, entertainment. I try to cast a pretty wide net, but inherently fantasy sports is pretty niche to begin with. And then when you start chopping that down into individual fantasy sports, I found a niche with golf. I still do football, I still do all that stuff, but a lot of people know me because I talk about fantasy golf and gambling on golf. It does seem like now, in such a selected media world where I can download anything I want, I can stream anything I want, and I can listen to it on demand, that niche podcasts about one certain subject have really taken off. And it doesn't necessarily require the same sort of audience that we are just accustomed to in the past. Like, even looking at TV ratings, that TV ratings 10 years ago were 5 times as high as they are now. And something that gets to like a 2.3 in terms of the Nielsen rating, is huge business now. If you can get that, you're doing great. And before it's like, oh, if you're doing below 10 as a primetime show, you're going to be canceled by the time Sweeps comes around. So in terms of Challenge Mania, you guys have really separated yourself. I guess the Brain Candy podcast as well as sort of like the two pillars in terms of the challenge podcast industry. But is there enough interest, even with a Patreon, even with live shows, even with a shop, to sustain this as a viable business that you can live off of?
Truth be told, you can't really answer that because you can't predict the future and how, trends will go and whatnot. What I'll say is this. So I mentioned earlier, like I've been a fan of the podcast medium since the start. I spend a lot of time by myself, whether it was when I was PAing, sitting in a van, or a couple times when I was PAing and just taking whatever job I could, I would say, I was done working on Top Model. Okay, next job's in California on Amazing Race. I'm going to drive to California by myself. And even today, I do a lot of walking to work. I do a lot of time at the gym. So I love podcasting from the start. And at first, a lot of the podcasts I listened to were, as you mentioned, more, based on the host. So like, for instance, like a Bill Simmons, who, I consider to be one of the pioneers in podcasting and also one of the pioneers in involving other things. Like he's a huge fan of the challenge or pop culture with sports and kind of combining those things. And you can be a fan of both. You can be a fan of more of one or the other, and you can kind of pick and choose. And he's obviously turned that into with Grantland and The Ringer, and obviously his Page 2 column initially, that's sort of been something that he was always at the forefront of, but now is really more common on most podcasts you listen to, or just in general in the space now. It's sort of accepted that stuff can be broad. Now, that being said, within, say, the Ringer umbrella, you have your Game of Thrones podcast. You have your wrestling podcast. You have your golf podcast. And the reason what you said about podcasting and things being niche, it's the same thing with music. And it's because it's everything has become so easy to basically become your own DJ. Why do I need to listen to K-Rock, which is a station I grew up listening here in New York, which I loved listening to K-Rock because it would introduce me to new music. But occasionally you would have to hear songs that you knew you didn't like. They'd come on every now and then. You'd have to deal with them to get to the next song that maybe you like or you haven't heard yet. Gone are those days. I go on Apple Music, and sure, sometimes I'll put on a playlist where I don't know the music 100%, but for the most part, I can pick every song I ever listen to and decide if I wanted to never hear a song I don't like for the rest of my life. Subject-wise, the same thing is that when it comes to podcasts now, I listen to shows that are about things that I really like. And occasionally you'll have someone like a Bill Simmons or a Mark Maron or a Joe Rogan or someone like that who I'll listen to their podcast depending on the guest. And when they have a larger percentage of guests I'm into, I'll listen to that show more. But if they have a guest where I'm genuinely just it's not even disinterested, but just don't even know about the space at all. Like, for instance, you bring up golf. I'm not a golf person. I envy golf people. I wish I was a golf person. I guess all my friends decided to go and get good at golf while I was watching Survivor Series or something. And I'm so embarrassed by how bad I am that I can't even stomach it. So I'm just not a golf person. So if you had like Jim Nantz on to talk about the Masters, I'd probably sit that one out. And that's fine. Except I'm probably never listening to a golf podcast. And the same thing with Challenge Mania, which is when I meet people at a dinner party or I'm talking to my friends from high school, whatever, I explain it to them like this. I go, we have a podcast where if you like the challenge or ideally love the challenge, you will probably love our podcast. Our goal is to have a podcast where if you like the challenge, you have to listen to our podcast. But if you don't watch the challenge, sure, I can be entertaining. Sure, we might divert into talking about Game of Thrones or wrestling for 5 minutes. Do not listen to our podcast by any means. Like sometimes people will try to be nice and they're like, oh, I'll check it out. I go, do you watch Challenge? No, but I'll check it out to support you. Please don't even, if you want, subscribe on your phone so we get like the download number. Don't waste your time. Find out what you love and listen to that. I would rather that because, to me, I mentioned the podcast I used to do, A Shot of Yeager. It's still my Twitter handle, but it used to be my podcast that I did where I was having people on, whatever guest I could get. And I never really, got an entire audience. I never got the political audience from, I had Bill Maher on. Now the whole political comedy audience is listening to my next interview with Scott Stapp. I'm having Scott Stapp on. I'm not getting all the Creed fans to listen to my next interview with Mercedes Lewis from the Jaguars. I had Mercedes Lewis. I'm not getting every Jaguars fan to listen to my interview with Brian Alvarez from Wrestling Observer. So I was never taking a whole audience with me. I'll quote like Jeff Ross, right? He's a comedian known now widely as the Roast Master General. When the roasts were starting to take off, he was a little bit self-conscious about he didn't want to be known as the roast guy. He would rather be like Jeff Ross, a stand-up comedian selling out theaters who sometimes does a roast. And Dave Chappelle said, hey, man, stay in your lane. You know, you got a lane. You got a great lane. Stay in your lane. And he realized, wow, if you stay in your lane, now Jeff Ross, he actually, with a friend of mine, he has a show on Netflix now, Historical Roast. He hosts every single roast. He's selling out, you know, theaters everywhere 10 years later because people want them to roast other people and themselves. People come up to him and say, hey, Jeff, roast me, roast me, roast me. And he's taken ownership of it. And now that's his lane and he owns that lane. And so sometimes, like, look, I have interests just like you. You know, it's funny, like you see all the stuff behind me. Those are Challenge Mania posters. I got Frank Sinatra and Green Day. I envy your set. You got the wrestling figures. You got, like, you know, I can tell we both have eclectic tastes in stuff like that. Sports, wrestling, entertainment, media, whatever it is. I try to infuse a little bit like that, but I get that our audience is a challenge audience. And when it comes to our Patreon, where we do bonus content, that's where we play with a little bit of other stuff. I might do a WrestleMania preview or an Oscars preview where people can pick and choose whether to listen to that or not. But I know that our Challenge Mania iTunes feed is people who want to hear from Paula or Alton or Cara Maria or Kendall or Kayla. I know that that's what they want. I know they don't want just me and Derek talking about Game of Thrones or Avengers Endgame. Sometimes we will give them some of that, or we will have someone come on from a Big Brother or a Survivor, which, again, it's reality TV, it's all related. But to me, stay in your lane. That's what I found. And that's why I think that as long as the challenge is on and doing roughly 1 million viewers, and even if it doesn't, and as long as we can have a section of that viewership, because here's the thing. Is it sustainable? If we were already at what I considered the peak of potential for our show, and this we were borderline not sustainable now, I would say maybe not. But the challenge does 1 million viewers a week. And some of our episodes over time have done 60, 80, 100,000 downloads. But our average listenership per episode is around 30, 35,000 downloads, which for a podcast is great. We bring in some nice advertising dollars. We obviously have the Patreon. We obviously do the live show. But that's telling me that there's 950 people out there who maybe have never heard of Challenge Mania or don't have it as a part of their daily routine yet. And I know enough about podcasting as a medium to know that that's not necessarily because we suck. It's because podcasting still has room to grow. People still have an iPhone and don't know that that little purple logo means that they can listen to whatever radio show they want at whatever time they want, especially people from an older generation or a lot of people from a much younger generation who haven't really started to use their phones as much. Like, there's tons of room to grow. With the Patreon, it's a company I had never heard of until I heard Brain Candy talk about it. They do their thing a little differently. They basically, their podcast, Brain Candy on iTunes, is 99.9% not challenge content. They do 1 or 2 episodes a year where they're talking about the challenge, but for the most part, they're sharing their brilliant views on politics or, you know, gender issues or just like what Susie had for lunch that day or Sarah getting married or whatever. And then if you want the challenge content from them, you're paying at the premium at the Patreon, which I do. I am a paid Brain Candy patron. With us, we do it a little differently. We keep our challenge interviews on iTunes for free. We do at least 1 a week for our general audience, and we do luckily have sponsors that help make that viable. But we decided to start a Patreon for 2 reasons. One, if you want to help contribute to our show and ensure that Derek and I will be able to do this full time for longer, great. And then also we're going to do bonus content over there. We're going to do a thing called the War Room during the War of the World season, where after every episode we go and we do a podcast, most of the time just me and Derek, but sometimes we'll bring in a Tony or a Melinda or a Jasmine to break down that episode. That's just 1 week, 1 episode. And the reason I don't like that as content on iTunes is because that is not an evergreen subject matter. You're talking about 1 episode. People either now they're on to the next episode or they haven't seen that episode yet, so it's a spoiler. And so that's why I keep the free stuff as the long form interviews that hopefully you can listen to. We get people who write us every week and say, hey, I just discovered your podcast and I listened to all 130 episodes. I doubt someone's going to all of a sudden discover our podcast and listen to an episode about the 4th episode of War of the Worlds once we're on season 35. So that's the fun bonus content we can bring people. We do the contests. We do pre-sales for our tickets, for our live shows. We try to keep people engaged and create a community with the Patreon. But those people are helping supplement a lot of the income for Derek and myself that we would have to run to have other jobs. But we at the moment don't. And hopefully we are able to keep this thing going and building it. And I will say there's no way to look inside of a crystal ball and say whether 1 year, 2 years, 3 years down the line that this will be bigger, better, or the same or still sustainable. But I would lean towards yes rather than no based on the data we have so far.
So what I've found for me is I do evergreen shows from time to time, but I keep everything consistently on one feed. And there's no chance that anyone's ever going to subscribe to the Pat Mayo Experience and go back and listen to all these episodes because it's last week's golf tournament, fantasy football for this week, that kind of thing, with all the other stuff kind of scattered in between. And I just feel like setting up a new feed for that just won't generate the same sort of downloads. Like I have it set. This is where people are used to finding it, and even telling people on it if it's, people have it set to auto download kind of thing. Those are, even if people don't listen, yet they download every single week, those are still very valuable downloads. Those still count towards the totals. That starting up a new feed for evergreen content for me in particular wouldn't be so wise. At least I don't think. So I really like what you're saying there in terms of people can go back, they can catch up to it. Some of my favorite podcasts that I've gotten into late are kind of set up exactly the same way, is that they don't go out of date. And if they do, it's by a very marginal amount. So I guess the other thing too is doing these live shows, setting up the shop, and really trying to monetize Challenge Mania in this way. Would that even be possible without the experience that you had in production anyway? Like you said, you worked on America's Top Model, you've worked on different things in terms of like the Winter Hockey Classic, running that sort of thing. So you're used to in-studio stuff, but also have that experience with on-location shooting. If you didn't have that experience, would this even be possible?
No, I mean, well, it would be possible to try, and there would be a longer trial and error period. You got to remember also, a lot of the stuff I was doing in production revolved around travel, revolved around budgets, revolved around negotiating fees, revolved around locations. I also did have an, albeit brief, but comedy career where I learned kind of the way that these club promoters work. And those are the venues we're using for these shows, are comedy clubs. I think it's a nice venue for what we're trying to do. And then also the other thing was, just basically by being a fan of the podcast medium and having seen other people do certain things, I've really stolen, I'm not even going to say taken advice, well, I've stolen a lot of what some other successful podcast ventures have done as far as, I'll give you an example. So there's a podcast I love called Something to Wrestle with Bruce Pritchard, who it's their long form stories about old, either it's single subject. So it's either sort of the podcast would be about Jake the Snake's entire career in WWE/WWF, or it might be about WrestleMania 9. And Bruce Pritchard was Vince McMahon's right-hand man during all this time. And they're great behind-the-scenes stories. He does these vibrant impressions of Vince McMahon and all this stuff. And it's great. And it's infectious. And he has this co-host named Conrad Thompson, who essentially is sort of the Scott Yeager of that operation. Bruce Pritchard is the one with the on-camera and behind-the-camera experience. Because he was also Brother Love. He's the Derek Kaczynski. And Conrad is the Scott Yeager. And Conrad asks the questions. He does all the branding. He does all the, puts together all the stuff. And he also is essentially the person who, sees the big picture and turn this thing into a full-fledged three-dimensional thing with a shop. And they're constantly putting out new t-shirts, and they do live shows. I've been to some of their live shows. And them, as well as Rob has a podcast, which is a very successful, started as a Survivor podcast, but he has branched out and now has a huge podcast network where they do shows for Amazing Race and Big Brother, and they even have one for The Challenge. And he now is this podcast mogul who does 4 to 5 podcasts a week, while also supplementing smaller podcasts where he has co-hosts that I'm sure he pays, and they kind of do their own shows, and he oversees all of it, and they have a Patreon. And I've kind of not only taken notes, I've flat out stolen a lot of the stuff that these successful operations have done, and I've repurposed it for what we've done, because I'm a guy who I go out there, and on the days I'm not working, I'm going to live podcasts. When I'm bored online, I'm looking at the WWE shop. I'm looking on eBay. I'm listening to other podcasts. I'm going to Comic-Con. I'm waiting online for stuff. So I'm a consumer, and I try to take what I would want as a consumer and as a super fan for all these things, and I try to bring it to our audience with this. And I think it'd be pretty darn cool if I was a Challenge Mania fan or a Challenge fan, if I could go and I could see a 1.5 to 2 hour live show on stage with a bunch of challengers that you almost never see in the same place. You almost never see them in the same room. They're having this organic, funny conversation. It's being led by someone who watches enough of the challenge where I can infuse the challenge talk and the stats, but I also have a comedy background, I have a hosting background, and I can keep it moving as well. And before that, it'd be great if I could come and get like a nice clean photo, a well-lit photo with Kellyanne or Nehemiah or whoever. If I can get a poster signed by them. I mean, you see these posters. We have this amazing artist, Craig Marrier, who does one of these for every one of our shows. Those come with when we do the VIP meet and greet. People get those. If I could buy a t-shirt, these are all things that other industries have been doing for years. You see me wearing my Macho Man Randy Savage shirt. You have some LJN wrestling figures behind you. Wrestling to me has been so inspiring for this venture, and in the sense of like, I've taken a lot of what I've seen not just from the big conglomerates, the WCWs, WWEs of the world, but also the smaller wrestling podcasts that, because they're wrestling fans, they know how to do it too. Dave Meltzer, who's like at the forefront of wrestling journalism, I've been a subscriber of his newsletter and in turn audio podcast for almost 2 decades now. They were doing online radio shows on a thing called IATA before the term podcasting ever existed. And so wrestling has constantly been at the forefront of the internet, at the forefront of podcasting, all of this stuff, not just the wrestling companies, but the people who cover and appreciate wrestling too. As you know, wrestling, WWE just signed a huge multi-$100 million deal with Fox. And again, also in turn with USA for their 2 big shows, because wrestling is one of the few things where people still like to watch it live and tweet about it online. It's fewer and far between that there's things like that. You might your favorite show might be Mad Men, but you don't need to be on Twitter live tweeting about what John Hamm did during Mad Men. People still do it with wrestling, and people actually still do it with reality TV and the challenge too. So I saw a gap between wrestling. If you like wrestling, guess what? I decided I like wrestling. Well, next time they come to the Garden, I'm going. Next time they come to Barclays, I'm going. I like Macho Man Randy Savage. Well, I can get this shirt. I can snap into a Slim Jim. I can do whatever I want. There's a million different ways to show your fandom for that. The challenge doesn't and didn't have that. And reality TV in general didn't. I mean, with Survivor, you have Rob has a podcast, sure, and there are other successful podcasts for other successful shows. And The Challenge has other podcasts too, and I implore you to look at all of them. But something I wanted to try instantly and strike while the iron was hot with Challenge Mania was give people a way they could show people at work, show people at the gym that they like the challenge, that they like Derek, that they like Kayla, that they like Cara, that they like Mark Long. Boom. Now we sell t-shirts for half of the challengers out there. That people want to go and meet the challengers that they like. They want to see Challenge Mania live. Boom, there's something they can go to. And that's why I tried to get that stuff off the ground as quickly as possible. And if someone tried to do that as quickly as I did without 10 years of essentially doing that behind the scenes for other stuff where they weren't fully the person who would get the blame if the thing went wrong, because like I was doing these things, I was a cog in a larger wheel for these huge productions where there's a lot of stress and it's very high profile. But again, it's not the Scott Yeager show. It's not Challenge Mania. It's not my brand. It's not my company. I got 10 years of doing that where I had someone above me, I had someone below me who could help cut some of the slack, who could help, hey, give me some advice. Now I'm everything. Now I am, I'm our executive producer, I'm our host, I'm our audio engineer, I'm our intern. When you order merchandise from us that doesn't come directly from our shop, I'm probably going to the post office and mailing it to you. I do a lot of fan interaction stuff on Twitter. I do giveaways and stickers. There's a pile of envelopes on my desk right now that are people who I just randomly decided to send out our new challenge accepted Live Strong bracelet to, just because they bought tickets to our new show. I picked a couple people. I am physically going to mail those out. I don't have Tanya or Steven, as I was joking about before, to go and do that for me, because we don't have an intern. We don't have an assistant, because at this point in our venture, there's no point in having that where I live 2 blocks from a post office. But so, I do all of that, and I do all of it in a welcoming fashion, because I adore being a part of what this has become, as you mentioned. I appreciate the kind words earlier. It really has taken off. People are loving it. And the thing that is the coolest about it is the community around it. We have people who come not just to one of our shows, but get on planes and travel to our shows. We just did Denver this past weekend, and there was dozens of people there who are patrons of our show, but also whether they're patrons or not, they've come to several live shows. They've made friends. These people are now coming to reconnect with the friends that they made at the last Challenge Mania Live, like it's summer camp. We're providing that for people. There's people, I tell people all the time, I see people comment, they go, "Oh, I'd love to go to this, but none of my friends like the challenge." Dude, don't bring the tag along. I can spot every show. I can spot the tag along. There's a guy sitting like this while his wife is waiting online to meet Derek. He's kind of just sitting there, or better yet, he's standing there holding the camera while his wife wants to come take a picture, and he's ready, whatever. And I'm just like, tag along. Next time, don't bring the tag along. Come by yourself. You'll make a million friends. I see these people interacting online. They've got their group chats, their secret group chats. They've got their online Twitter communities. I see them. They're nicer to each other than anyone in my life has ever been. I mean, these are people who have known each other for less than a year, and they're wishing each other happy birthday and being super supportive and nice. They know all their kids' names, and they met at Challenge Mania, and they use our show and they use the challenge as a through line for what they have in common. I stopped wasting time asking people if they want to go to stuff with me years ago. If somebody has already told me, hey, I want to go to this, I want to go to that, sure. I'm not going to go through my phone and try to find somebody to go to that concert with me, go to that wrestling show with me. I'll go by myself, because I know I'll have a better conversation with the person next to me, because they're as into wrestling as I am, because we have the same row seat, or they're as into Panic at the Disco as I am, because we have the same seat at the Panic at the Disco concert. I'll have more fun talking to them than I will if I bring my cousin who's like, kind of, yeah, are they going to play that song about the chiming in? I don't need that. And so like our community is people who really love the challenge. Most of them, 99.9% of them, are super positive about it, which I love. And we give them an outlet for that. We give them somewhere they can come and express that and have fun with it. We give them something they can buy to show that, or they can win to show that, or whatever it is. And we're going to keep doing it because there was a void for it. You look, is it a smart business move to start something up where there's a void? Sure. But honestly, like, when I say there was a void for it, I mean, I'm happy to have filled that void for all these people. I mean, there's a million people who watch the challenge every week. And of those millions, there's probably hundreds of thousands of people, don't get me wrong, who like to put on the challenge, watch it, and then go on with their day. They want to then put on, whatever, Dead to Me on Netflix, and then they want to go to sleep. They want to wake up the next morning. They don't want to talk about the challenge. They don't care what Kayla had for breakfast. I get that. There's hundreds of thousands who don't. But for the other group that do care, that do follow these people on social media, that want the added news, that want the added content, I love that we are giving that to them, because I'm someone who appreciates so much of that in so many other realms, whether it be Survivor or Game of Thrones or movies in general, film award shows or whatever. I'm a podcast junkie. I listen to 50 podcasts a week. So I'm happy to be the one podcast that a lot of challenge fans listen to.
Last thing, and this might work out easier for you because you have a background and even just like not only in media, but financing in media, knowing what things cost. Then you have the cachet of having Derek on the podcast, who's a well-known name and brand within the sort of sub-community that you guys are talking about. But how do you go about selling ads on the podcast from just starting out to where you guys are now? I assume now that you either linked up with one of the podcast ad agencies where they can push people towards you, people might reach out towards you, but I would think at the beginning it might work the other way, where you have to have to actively go seek out people to advertise on your show.
Yeah, I was really lucky because very early on we partnered up with somebody who has that. I was basically just asking someone for advice, and they were like, well, I'll sell ads for your podcast. And they do to this day. And since then, we've been a few people have tried to poach us and tried to get us to come over to their company and sell ads for us. We've stuck with the same people we've been with since the beginning, because we just like the synergy there. We like the energy, and we've been lucky because there's someone who sells ads for us. They basically just, every week I check the thing we have set up in the box. They let me know what spots I'm doing that week. And that's how we kind of fill that right there. And then we're obviously always advertising our own products as well. And then we have the Patreon, which I look at the Patreon because we keep the Patreon ad free, where essentially our sponsors are you guys. So we have kind of the general podcast, which is kept free because the sponsors pay us. And then we have the Patreon content, which is kept ad free because you guys pay for it as well. So I will say, advice wise, it's hard for me because we did early on, I think it was maybe about 20, 30 episodes in, I was just asking someone for advice, and they decided that they wanted to help us out, something about a podcast network. And then we're kind of, although we're not necessarily on their podcast network, they sell ads for us, and they do so very well. So we've kind of stuck with them. But I will say that even if we hadn't done that, some companies did start calling eventually. These companies they look at the iTunes charts, and we were very early on, and don't get me wrong, there are weird algorithms here where when a new podcast starts, they shoot to the top of the rankings. So we were like number one in film and TV for a while, and then once we started churning out, even though our numbers were better, we went down because when there's a spike in interest. And our ratings are very good. We have a ton of reviews and everything like that. But once you're kind of in there for a while, right now we kind of hover in the top 20 or so. Whereas for a while there, we were at the beginning, we're at the top of the list. And I would have people reach out, whether they were from, Audio Boom or, whatever they call these companies. They all have like some cool name that would make a really good name for like a club that you would go to listen to techno music. But they also sell podcast ads for you. And they all have really weird like exclusivity. We want you to sign this, and we want to basically have the rights to cite for this amount of time. And we actually, when we switched host sites, they wanted to sell ads for us too. But they wanted to have I said, well, can you guys sell some? And also the people we're already working with sell some? Like, no, we need to be, have sole ownership of kind of representing you. And I didn't love that. So we stuck with our people. But I will say they will come calling. If your numbers are good enough, they will come calling because they have people whose job it is to comb the iTunes charts, to look at the numbers. They'll then ask you for confirmation, but they're looking at those charts. And if you start spiking and you're showing up in those charts, they will come calling. I will say, if you're a very, very new podcast, something I'd recommend. So we're hosted by Spreaker, and something that we do, this is a third revenue stream, is that as you notice, if you've listened to Challenge Mania at the beginning, the way end, and then maybe once within the show, you'll hear an ad that isn't read by me. So if you hear an ad that's read by me, that's a sponsor we're working with directly, that's an Omaha Steaks, or that's a Brooklinen who's paying our podcast directly through that podcast network I was talking about, and they're giving me copy, I'm reading it during the show. That's one type of relationship. Our host site also just plugs in pre-recorded ads that are, pre-produced and have other voiceover talent and this and that. And they're very short, and those are sometimes targeted based on where you're living, or they might know that you're this type of person, so you might want to hear an ad for a bra, or you might want to hear an ad for football, or whatever it is. And those get plugged in automatically by Spreaker. We get paid for those very incrementally. That's like 19 cents a play or something like that. But it adds up, and it's a few $1,000s a month are coming just from automatically placed ads. You can do that regardless of how many listeners your podcast has. So I know Podbean, which was our original hosting site, they didn't have it at the time. They have it now. Spreaker has it too. So you can be making, obviously, it's going to be directly correlated to how many downloads you're getting. But I would highly recommend getting a hosting platform that has that ability for you to take part in that. Because look, it might be a few $100, it might be $50, but it's something. And what it will also do is it'll also like precondition your audience to knowing that there's ads, because albeit, people, you start with no ads like our show did, and then all of a sudden you have ads and people are like, how dare you make money? So, it's something you might want to do just so your audience knows there's the ability to have ads on your show, and you don't just sneak up on them all of a sudden, episode 10 with an ad. But I would recommend that. That's something that any podcast of any size can do, is find a hosting platform that has electronically or digitally placed ads where they're paying you for those. And I know Spreaker is one of them, Speaker, but with an R, Spreaker, and then Podbean as well, which was our hosting site before, and we had no qualms with them, but we did get poached by Spreaker. So either of those are good.
Scott Yager at Shot of Yager on Twitter. Tell everyone where they can find the Challenge Mania shop, download the Challenge Mania podcast, obviously Challenge Mania, if you just search that, you can find it, and the Patreon where people can go subscribe to get those bonus shows.
Yeah, so patreon.com/Challenge Mania. And I will say, look, guys, don't go outside your means. But if you do want to support the show, and if you do like bonus content, I implore you to check it out. For $15 a month, you get all of our bonus content. You get to vote in the Challenge Mania Hall of Fame. You get all of our giveaways. You get early access to all our on sales for tickets. But what I've done so far after War of the Worlds ended was I did at the $5 tier, I put up every single episode we did for the War Room, which is our bonus content that we do in season. If you do want to try that out, you can do so for $5 right now. You can probably bang out all 20 or whatever the episodes in a month. And you can decide if you do want to come on board for the $15 for season 34, whatever they end up calling that. That's patreon.com/Challenge Mania. And like I said, I appreciate it either way. No need to pay for our show if you can't do so. By paying attention to our show, you're doing enough. That's what I like to say. iTunes, Google Play, Spotify, you can get the show there. Just search Challenge Mania. ChallengeManiaPodcast.com will take you directly to Spreaker if you want to just get it there. I'm at Shot of Yeager, Yager on Twitter. I'm at Scott of Yeager on Instagram. Not so much now, but during the season, I like to live tweet and do some fun stuff during the episodes. If you're watching those on the East Coast time, we have a show on June the 22nd, Los Angeles, California. We're at the world famous Hollywood Improv on Melrose. We have a huge lineup. Davon Rogers, the Nolan twins, Derek Kaczynski and I are always there. We have Veronica Portillo, hello, a legend, Alton Williams, Sean Merriman for a football tie-in for your football fans out there. Sean Merriman, former San Diego Charger, all-pro linebacker. He played on Champs vs. Pros. He and I remain in contact from a few years ago. I did an interview with him, and he was elated to join us for this show. I'm very excited for that. So cool lineup. The tickets for that are at challengemania.la if you want that. And we just announced Derek's birthday bash is at Caroline's here in New York City, our home away from home, on his actual birthday, August 17th. You get tickets for that now at challengemania.live. And I think that's all I got. Oh, there's a cool Facebook page, facebook.com/Challenge Mania podcast. We announce a lot of stuff over there, and you can meet other Challenge Maniacs and all that good stuff. And I think that's all I got.
Hey, you got more plugs than I do. I guess I'll let people know that if you want to get into a draw for 20 DK bucks, smash the like on this episode. Leave your DraftKings handle in the comment section. Do not be scared to download, rate, review, and subscribe to the Pat Mayo Experience podcast at iTunes, Stitcher, Spotify, Podbean, Audio Boom, all of these great places you can find the Pat Mayo Experience. So I suggest you go check that out. Thank you all for watching and tuning in. I'm Pat Mayo. I'll see you next time.
Pat Mayo Experience. Experience!